The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A. With me today is Saabira Chauduri. Saabira Chauduri is a London-based journalist and the author of Consumed: How Big Brands Got Us Hooked on Plastic. She frequently writes about sustainability, plastics, corporate strategy, environmental regulation, and consumer culture. Her work has been published in outlets including The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Bloomberg, The New Scientist, The Guardian, Wired, The Times of India, FastCompany.com, Forbes, and Business Insider. Saabira Chauduri spent 12 years as a staff reporter for The Wall Street Journal in London and New York, stepping down in May 2025. Before that, she worked on staff for Dow Jones Newswire's Forbes magazine, Mint, a New Delhi-based business newspaper, and FastCompany.com. Saabira grew up in Bangalore and still returns there as much as she can. She earned a BA in sociology from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, then spent a year abroad studying law and sociology at the London School of Economics. She was awarded the Wall Street Journal's fully funded Asia Fellowship to New York University, where she earned an MA in Business and Economic Reporting. Consumed is her first book. It was born out of years of reporting on consumer goods companies' increasingly difficult relationship with plastic, and it was published by Bonnier Books in May 2025. Consumed was named one of the Financial Times Best Books of 2025 and shortlisted for the Society of American Business Editors and Writers Best Business Book of the Year Award. She did the impossible task of researching and writing the book while tending to her two children under 2. Saabira Chauduri, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thanks for having me.
We hear a lot these days about plastics in the oceans, microplastics in our bodies, and in the bodies of other animals and plants. Forever chemicals from plastics and plastics clogging waste streams. Are plastics a serious problem for our health or for the environment?
Yeah, it is a big question. And I think the broad question of whether all plastics are a serious problem for our health is one that researchers are still trying to figure out. It's very polarized. We know that some plastics are definitely bad for our health. A plastic called PVC, for instance, we've known for decades now that can have major health impacts. It's being linked to liver cancer. We also know that polystyrene, the monomer styrene in there has also been linked to cancer. So there are certain plastics we know to be problematic. There are other plastics like PET, HTPE, polypropylene, very widely used. Their health impacts, I think scientists are still trying to figure out. Depending on who you ask, you get very different answers. As a journalist, my job is sort of to try and look at all the evidence, talk to people on both sides, and I think there's a consensus building, but it remains to be seen how this will play out. And then for the environment, I mean, we're all pretty familiar with the impact that plastics has had on the environment, particularly on the waste side. We've all heard about the microplastics in our bodies, in the ocean, in animals. And of course, larger pieces of plastic waste are a big issue. I will say plastics has a complicated relationship when it comes to carbon emissions because, of course, it is derived almost entirely from fossil fuels, which we know to be a big driver of climate change. However, simultaneously, when you sort of try to substitute plastics with other materials like glass or paper or even aluminum in many cases, you run the risk of raising the overall carbon footprint because those products are heavier or maybe less functionally effective. So plastics has quite a complicated relationship with environmental impacts.
Yeah, and I appreciate the recognition that this is not a monolithic issue. We're looking at many different products with many different uses. But global plastic production in 1950 was 2 million metric tons. And the most recent data shows that plastics production is now more than 460 million tons per year. How did we get here?
Yeah, and that's sort of exactly the question that my book aims to answer. I will say I don't look at durable plastics, and a lot of plastic production has gone into durable products like planes and cars and furniture. I'm very focused on the single-use plastics we encounter on a daily basis. So things like the bags, the bottles, the diapers, the straws, the cups, all the stuff that I think people think of as problematic plastics because they are so widely littered. They're often very hard to recycle. And in terms of how we got here, there's a really interesting story to the plastics industry's boom, which is it was actually a very small industry before World War II. And then when the war hit, many materials fell into short supply. So you had things like rubber, metals, silk, even wood, that needed to be redirected to the war effort. And the plastics industry stood up and said, we can step in and fill the void. And so there were many things on the battlefield that plastics started to be used for. The industry grew capacity hugely over that time period. And then when the war wound down, it was much bigger. And there was this sort of decision the industry made to say, what do we do with all this increased capacity? Let's target the housewife. So there was a real pivot into things like advertising scratch-proof furniture and kind of wipeable floors and counters and unbreakable dinnerware. So initially, for the first few years after World War II, it was still quite durable materials, lots of stuff that went into the home, into the kitchen. Increasingly, however, there was a pivot towards more single-use packaging. And my book spends a lot of time looking at various single-use products, charting, their history, how companies came up with them. So I look at the trash bag, I look at the plastic drinks bottle, I look at the disposable diaper and a few other products. And I think the plastics industry and consumer goods companies who adopted this packaging or these plastics, they really saw single-use plastics as a way to massively turbocharge consumption, really introduce an entirely new way of behaving. People became very used to convenience, they became used to portability, they became used to affordability, and plastics really fundamentally rewired everything from the way we parent to the way we clean to the way we eat, shop, our fundamental expectations, ideas about responsibility, community. There's so much there. And so, yeah, it's sort of it's a big question with an answer that I think the book, that's the book's overarching theme.
And I understand that about half of global production now is in single-use plastics, which is an extraordinary amount of material. We have, as you mentioned, we have lots of sort of different categories of stuff, all the durable goods like in automobiles and electronics and the giant water tanks all the way down to little buckets and construction materials that are all essentially plastic products. And then there's things that are, I guess, nominally durable but routinely wear out, like clothing and tires. All the
two big sources of microplastics. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's all the stuff that's designed to be single use, and that's with that as roughly half. How did we get so hooked on this single use type product, and especially, one of my personal pet peeves is I hate all the packaging that everything comes in, which is mostly plastic.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a very broad question. So maybe if we narrow it and just kind of look at, for instance, the supermarket, which actually came about thanks to individually chopped, packaged, and priced products, and plastics, particularly cellophane, and then later other wraps, were really very instrumental in creating the modern supermarket. Because before you had prepackaged goods, you would go to the butchers to get your meat. You might go to the fishmonger. You would go to the greengrocer to get your vegetables. Your milk might be delivered to your home. So everything was sort of much more fragmented, and pre-wrapped, pre-packaged products really brought all of that under one roof, which is what I flagged at earlier when I was saying plastic packaging has fundamentally transformed the way that we live and shop and our expectations about convenience. And in some ways, it really went from there. Like, food was really the first big domain that the single-use plastics industry captured. And a big reason for that was there just were these huge benefits about convenience. Previously, things were wrapped in, opaque paper, maybe, or they were placed behind the counter. People couldn't see them. The plastics industry very early on realized that seeing products all arrayed, shining in this gleaming packaging, actually spurred impulse buying. And so they spent a lot of time convincing retailers that if they chose plastic, people would buy more. And people did. Similarly, when you look at something like the plastic soda bottle, it was initially invented to sell people more soda, because big glass bottles were just too heavy, they would break. So Coca-Cola said, we need an alternative that would allow us to sell people 3 liters, 4 liters. So they came up with the plastic drinks bottle. That proved to be so successful. It was portable, it was lightweight, people liked it, that Coke then started making smaller bottles, and soon the PET drinks bottle became the dominant way to sell soda, along with the aluminum can. And you kind of see this playing out industry by industry. If we leave the US for a second and we move over to India, I have a chapter focused on how the single-use sachet, which is essentially a little plastic pouch, really built a market for shampoo in India where none previously existed. So people, they wash their hair at home with homemade concoctions. Maybe they use bar soap. Most Indians couldn't really afford to buy a bottle of shampoo. Unilever completely sort of changed that habit that people had, and it sort of blitzed the country with billions of these tiny plastic sachets that people could afford because they just had a single-use portion of shampoo. And you kind of see this trend of plastic starting as a niche product in some ways, like they were intended to do certain things, so cater to poorer people, or just house the large quantities of soda, or in the case of the disposable diaper, it was initially thought of as being just for travel or for weekends away. But quickly, people liked the convenience, they liked the affordability, and plastics kind of spiraled into becoming, everyday items. So, yeah, I think there was an inevitability about plastics march forward because it is functionally so amazingly good at what it does. And it wasn't cheap to start with at all. It was actually very expensive. But as plastics scaled, as volume grew, as companies became more efficient, integrated plastic deeply into their supply chains, prices just kept getting lower and lower and lower, which was another big reason to choose it. So, yeah, in some ways, I think looking back, you sort of see how it started out as this quite small, discrete uses, and then just spiraled into being something that was used absolutely everywhere for everything.
And I've observed, I haven't been to India, but I imagine the trash collection infrastructure is not what it is in most American cities. And I've observed in places like Central America and Morocco, stuff will be, a lot of this plastic trash will end up in a open dump, and then it just gets blown away or washed away when there's precipitation, and it ends up just anywhere. Is that an issue in India?
Yes. No, it's a huge issue in India and many parts of the world. I mean, it's even an issue in the UK where I live. You see plenty of plastics littered. If it's not dumped, but you see plastic waste quite regularly. It's a much more severe issue in places that don't even have recycling infrastructure or maybe even basic waste collection. And I think what's so striking about the plastic industry's march forward is back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the early 80s, nobody was really thinking about, well, what's going to happen with all of this plastics once people are done with it. And a big part of the reason behind this is many of these innovations came from the US, which had and still has plentiful landfill space. The thing that stopped the industry in its tracks, as I sort of talk about in detail in the prologue of my book, was in 1987, this garbage barge called the Mobro 4000 started sailing around the US looking for a place to dump the 3,000 tons of garbage it was carrying. This waste was from Long Island. Landfills there were running out of space, and the Mobro needed to take the garbage elsewhere. But everywhere it went, it went to North Carolina, Louisiana, went to Mexico, Bahamas, Belize. Everywhere it tried, turned it away and said, no, we don't want this trash. And that became a nightly news story picked up by media outlets across the US and eventually in many places around the world. And all of a sudden, Americans woke up and said, my goodness, we are running out of landfill space. We need to do something. And that was the first big backlash that the US saw against single-use plastics, because at the time you did have solutions in place. You could recycle paper, aluminum, glass, you could compost food, but there was no end-of-life solution for plastics apart from burning it, which we know releases toxic fumes, or landfilling it. It turns out America was not running out of landfill space. Landfills were closing down, which is why people thought this, and particularly on the coastlines, in the east in particular, the landfills were short on space. But what ended up happening is the garbage was just trucked to the middle of the country, to places that had plentiful space. So prices of dealing with that waste went up for a lot of places, but the waste could still be landfilled. And so I think the development of these ideas, this packaging, was done in a way that was just about making the most money possible, growing revenue, selling to as many people as possible. Nobody was thinking about, well, what do we do with this plastics once people have finished with it? And I think this has always been the Achilles heel of the plastics industry, because they have, in retrospect, tried to superimpose solutions upon this packaging and these single-use products rather than deal with the business model at source. And none of these solutions, whether it be recycling or incineration or coming up with biodegradable alternatives, none of them have been able to scale for a variety of reasons I talk about in the book. And so that is why I think we are in the situation we're in today.
Yeah. For listeners who may just be tuning in, my guest is Saabira Chauduri. She is a London-based journalist and the author of a book, Consumed: How Big Brands Got Us Hooked on Plastic. And we've been talking about what she learned in her research to put this book together. And you mentioned, Saabira, the issue of recycling. And for years, we heard that we were supposed to recycle our plastics, and even had little marks on each plastic item of what kind of recycle symbol it had. But it's now evident that most plastics are really not particularly recyclable. Could you talk about the industry's role in promoting recycling?
Yeah. So from the get-go, there have only been so there are many, many different types of plastics, but there are 7 broad families. And if you look on a plastic container, quite often you will see a triangular symbol of chasing arrows with a number in the middle. That chasing arrow symbol was developed in the late 1980s by the plastics industry because recyclers were kind of struggling to figure out what type of plastic they were getting. And so the industry said, let's put a symbol on these containers to help recyclers out. What ended up happening is consumers started seeing that symbol and assuming that anytime a container had a chasing arrows on it, that meant it was recyclable. And so there was a mass amount of contamination, what we call wish cycling, which is people putting all kinds of things into recycling bins that were not in fact recyclable. Rather than try to correct this misconception, the plastics industry essentially ran with it. It was great PR for them. It looked like all of these plastics were recyclable. But that move has really come back to bite the industry badly, because one of the big reasons plastics recycling is not viable in the same way that glass or paper is that there are just so many different types. And sorting all of these types from each other takes a lot of work and a lot of money. And if you don't have a buyer on the other end who's willing to take the used plastics and make a new product out of them, nobody is going to pay for that process to happen. So really, PET, which is the plastic used to make drinks bottles, and HDPE, which is the plastic used to make milk jugs, those are really the only two plastics that have consistently been recycled at scale. And in the US, the recycling rates for those are extremely poor compared to most of the world. A big reason for this is most US states do not have bottle deposits, so containers do not get taken back to a specific facility that can recycle them. A lot of them just get trashed or get mixed up with other alleged recyclables, and they're kind of too dirty to clean. It's just not economically viable. But really, the big problem has come with our move towards a lot of lightweight, flexible plastics. So things like the bags, the multi-layer pouches, the food wrap, the fast food packaging, a lot of the things that we see littered. That plastic is very, very economically unviable to recycle. Nobody is willing to pay to make something new out of that stuff. And so a big reason why plastics recycling is failing is it is just, there is no system in place for the vast majority of plastics. And the industry, their take on this has been, let's try a different form of recycling, something called chemical recycling. So rather than chopping up and washing and melting, plastics so you can turn them into new plastics, they use chemical processes to essentially break these plastics back down to their original building blocks and then build them back up again into pure virgin plastic. Chemical recycling has been around for decades. It's never scaled. It's extremely expensive. It's very energy intensive. It's very unclear that there is any net benefit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's a very controversial technology, but it's sort of what the industry is betting big on in order to be able to keep pumping out this single-use packaging that cannot otherwise be mechanically recycled.
Yeah, and you said what the industry is betting on. So I mean, obviously they're under pressure in some cases from governments and in some cases from consumers. Globally, I understand that about 50% of plastic waste ends up in landfills. About 2/3 of that is packaging, single-use stuff. About 19% is incinerated, which you mentioned earlier, releases some toxic chemicals into the atmosphere. And less than 2% globally is actually recycled. The rest just ends up in our soils, waterways, and in the ocean. So I've heard some environmental organizations calling for, restrictions on production of plastic. And, in California, we actually have some laws limiting certain single-use plastics. For example, grocery bags. Now you can't get plastic grocery bags in supermarkets in California. So I wondered if you can talk about, what can we do to reduce this burden of plastic waste?
Yeah, it's a huge question. Some, product bans, I think, are appropriate. Like things like plastic bags are so widely littered, they escape into the environment. So often we have a viable alternative, which is it's very easy to bring your own bag. So I am in favor of kind of siloed bans of certain products we know to be problematic and where there is an alternative in place. I think where it gets quite tricky is when you look at kind of plastic packaging overall. It's not necessarily just the grocery bags or the cutlery or the occasional plastic straw that's the problem. It's all of the food packaging, the fast food packaging, the cups, the delivery bags. There's so much else out there that we don't have good solutions for. So there's a couple of ways to approach this. So one is this idea called extended producer responsibility, which basically says rather than us, the taxpayers, paying for the cost of managing all of this waste that companies have chosen to make and then sell to us, we will put the tab, the price of this back on the company. The responsibility, the financial responsibility lies with the company. And of course, the argument then is that consumer prices will go up. Yes, they probably will go up a little bit, but companies are very good at absorbing costs. They're very good at finding ways to innovate and be efficient. So having extended producer responsibility would allow us at least to have recycling programs in place for the plastics we know can be recycled, and make sure that countries around the world have basic waste collection in place. Because at the moment, if you're choosing between funding your health service, your fire department, your schools, or your waste collection, and you are a poor country, the waste collection is always going to go away first. So we need companies to step up and be the ones funding that, because they're the ones who make and sell us this packaging. And then another thing which California has implemented as well is putting in place certain minimum recycle content requirements. I mentioned how plastic could be recycled if you don't have a buyer on the other end. So if you have a minimum recycle content requirement, it means that new packaging has to be made at least partly from old packaging, which means you have a buyer in place, you have a market. That's going to spur the infrastructure we need to make recycling work. So that's another kind of place we could do a lot. I think ultimately, though, we need to take a long, hard look at where we're using plastic, why we're using it, how we're using it. There was a report that came out about a year and a half ago that said there are 16,000 chemicals that have been found to be used in plastics in some manner. Some of them are there intentionally, many of them are there unintentionally. So we have this very wide body of chemicals being used that we don't necessarily have safety data on. We know some of the chemicals actually are hazardous. So I think just drastically narrowing the pool of plastics that we use. So rather than having I mentioned there are 7 families, but within those there are many types and subtypes. And so you can have like hundreds and hundreds of different types of plastics using thousands of different chemicals. I think we really need to narrow that pool so that we're using a handful of types of plastics and a much shorter list of approved chemicals that we have tested and know to be safe and can be monitored. And then I think we sort of need to look at just business models. There's a lot of things that will be very difficult to change, particularly when it comes to food in the supermarket. Like, are we all going to go back to the butchers and really buy kind of meat that is being cut in front of us and isn't prepackaged? Feels unlikely. Maybe there will be kind of some bio-based compostable alternatives that will eventually be developed, but you would need to have composting infrastructure in place to ensure those things are actually composted. So there's a whole other level of complexity there. You can't just make compostable or biodegradable packaging and then just put it in a regular bin or hope it'll somehow break down on its own. It has to actually arrive at a facility that is equipped to deal with it. So I think it's just such a big question, and there are people trying to answer this for different products, different category, because there really is no one-size-fits-all answer. I think reuse could play a big role in drinks bottles, maybe in coffee cups. I don't see reuse playing a big role in most food packaging. It doesn't make sense from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective to replace a very light, flexible product with a much heavier, rigid container. That container would need to be used maybe 30 or 40 or even 50 times before it sort of breaks even with the single-use version. So I think reuse has a role to play, but we sort of need to be very targeted about where we roll it out, how we roll it out. So it's a very complicated issue that many very intelligent people are working on at the moment.
Well, we're about out of time, and I want to give you an opportunity to remind listeners how they might find your book.
Yeah. So Consumed, How Big Brands Got Us Hooked on Plastic. It's available on Amazon, US, bookshop.org. You can get it at Barnes & Noble. It's available on your Kindle. You can download it as an audiobook. It's pretty widely available in the US. I think the paperback version will eventually be out at some point this year. For now, it's just the hardback. But I hope people give it a read. There's quite a lot of stuff about California in there through the different chapters. It's always been a more environmentally conscious state than many others. I hope people will give it a read.
Wonderful. Saabira Chauduri, thank you so much for this important work you've been doing, and thank you for being on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.